The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood as State Senator Wilson sat at his kitchen table, watching his children do their homework. His hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee as he thought about the conversation he needed to have with them again. As one of the few black senators in the state and a former civil rights lawyer, he knew these talks weren't just important, they were essential for their survival. His daughter Anne, a tall, confident 17-year-old with dreams of becoming a judge, was helping her younger brother Dave with his advanced math homework. At just 15, Dave was already taking college-level courses and had his sights set on becoming an engineer. The pride that swelled in Wilson's chest was mixed with a familiar worry, the same worry that had kept him up countless nights since they were born. "Kids," he called out softly, placing his coffee mug down. "Can we talk for a minute?" They looked up from their textbooks, recognizing the tone in their father's voice. It was the same one he used whenever he needed to prepare them for the realities of their world. Anne closed her calculus book and pulled her chair closer to her father, while Dave put down his pencil, his usual playful smile fading slightly. "I know we've had this conversation before," Wilson began, his voice gentle but firm. "But with everything happening in the news lately, I think it's time for a refresher." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Being who we are, being a black family in this position, it means we have to be extra careful." Anne nodded, her eyes showing wisdom beyond her years. "Dad, we know. We always carry our school IDs, we keep our hands visible if we're ever stopped, and we never argue with authority figures." "That's right," Wilson smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "But there's more to it than that. Being my children, being a senator's kids, it puts an even bigger spotlight on you. Some people might treat you differently because of it, either better or worse." Dave leaned forward, his voice quiet but steady. "Like last week when those security guards followed us around the mall, even though we were wearing our private school uniforms." Wilson's heart tightened, but he kept his expression calm. "Exactly. But remember what you both did." "We stayed calm," Anne said, straightening in her chair. "We spoke clearly and politely, and we made sure to get the manager's name and badge number. And we didn't let it ruin our day," Dave added, a hint of his usual smile returning. "We still got those books we wanted, and we even helped that lost kid find his mom." Wilson felt a surge of pride. His children had learned to navigate these situations with a grace that sometimes left him in awe. They'd taken the heavy lessons he taught them and transformed them into something powerful, a quiet strength that couldn't be shaken by ignorance or prejudice. "I'm proud of you both," he said, reaching out to squeeze their hands. "But these lessons, they're going to become even more important. Starting next week, you'll be driving yourselves to your volunteer work at the youth center." The kids' eyes lit up at the mention of driving, but Wilson held up his hand. "This means more responsibility. The Tesla has all the latest safety features, but it's also a nice car. People will notice it. They'll notice you in it." He pulled out his phone and opened a document they'd created together months ago. "Let's go over the protocol again. What's the first thing you do if you're pulled over?" For the next hour, they reviewed everything. Proper hand placement on the steering wheel, how to speak to law enforcement, when to call his office, and how to use the car's built-in cameras. They'd practiced scenarios with Anne and Dave demonstrating the calm, measured responses they'd learned over years of similar discussions. But this wasn't just about rules and procedures. As they talked, they shared stories and laughed about their day. Dave told them about his robotics project, and Anne excitedly described the mock trial she was preparing for. Wilson listened, adding his own jokes and stories, making sure this crucial lesson didn't feel like a burden. As the evening wore on, the kitchen filled with the smell of baking cookies, their family tradition after these serious talks. Dave had started the habit years ago, saying that tough conversations went better with chocolate chips. Now, as they sat together, enjoying warm cookies and cold milk, Wilson looked at his children with a mixture of love and determination. They were extraordinary kids, top of their classes, active in community service, and leaders among their peers. But more importantly, they were kind, thoughtful, and resilient. They'd learned to turn potential confrontations into conversations, to respond to prejudice with dignity, and to stand tall in a world that sometimes wanted to push them down. As Anne and Dave cleared the dishes, chatting about their plans for the upcoming youth center project, Wilson watched them with quiet pride. They carried themselves with a confidence that came from being well-prepared, well-educated, and well-loved. They understood their reality but refused to be limited by it. Little did any of them know that in just a few days, everything they'd practiced, every lesson they'd learned, would be put to the test in a way none of them could have anticipated. But for now, in the warmth of their kitchen, surrounded by the smell of cookies and the sound of teenage laughter, they were simply a family, sharing their lives, their love, and their strength with each other. The evening ended as it always did, with hugs, with hope, and with the unspoken understanding that while the world outside might not always be fair, they would face it together with dignity, intelligence, and an unshakable belief in justice. The autumn wind rustled through the trees as Anne and Dave walked out of the youth center, their spirits high after another successful mentoring session. They'd spent the afternoon helping younger kids with their homework and teaching basic coding skills. The satisfaction of making a difference showed in their bright smiles and energetic chatter. "Did you see how quickly Tyler picked up the programming concepts?" Dave said, pulling his light jacket closer against the cool breeze. "He's going to be better than me soon." Anne laughed, fishing the Tesla's keys from her backpack. "Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? Dad always says the best leaders are the ones who help others become even better than themselves." The siblings climbed into their father's car, with Anne taking the driver's seat. She'd had her license for 6 months now and took her driving responsibilities seriously. Dave settled into the passenger seat, already pulling out his phone to text their dad that they were heading home. "He's probably still in that budget meeting," Anne said, carefully backing out of the parking spot. "But you know how he likes us to keep him updated." The drive started peacefully enough. They took their usual route through the city's well-maintained streets, past the local shops and cafes where everyone knew them as the senator's kids. Anne kept exactly to the speed limit, and Dave hummed along to the classical music, playing softly through the car's speakers, a habit they'd picked up from their mother. They were about halfway home when Dave noticed it first, a police cruiser that had been following them for several blocks. "Anne," he said quietly, his voice calm but alert, "don't look now, but I think we should stop recording." Anne glanced in the rearview mirror, her hands steady on the wheel at the perfect 10 and 2 position their father had taught them. "Already on it," she replied, using the car's voice command to activate all cameras. "Check the glove compartment for Dad's letter." Their father had prepared a sealed letter explaining who they were, complete with his business card and contact numbers. It was just one of many precautions he put in place, hoping they'd never need to use them. Suddenly, the cruiser's lights flashed on. Then a second police car appeared, pulling up alongside them. Anne's heart beat faster, but her external calm never wavered as she carefully signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, following every protocol they'd practiced countless times. Dash cam recording, check. Phone recording, check. Hands visible, check, Dave muttered, going through their mental checklist. He pressed the emergency alert button on his phone, another of their father's safety measures that would send their location to his office and legal team. 4 officers approached the car, 2 on each side. Their hands were already on their weapons. Anne rolled down all the windows, turned off the engine, and placed her hands high on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Dave mirrored her actions, placing his hands palm up on his thighs. "Driver and passenger, exit the vehicle slowly with your hands where we can see them," one officer commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. Anne spoke clearly and calmly, just as they'd practiced. "Officer, I apologize, but I've been taught not to exit the vehicle unless given a specific reason. Could you please tell us why we're being stopped?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Another officer moved closer, his hand still on his weapon. "This vehicle matches the description of one involved in a reported incident. Exit the car now." Dave's voice was steady as he added, "Officers, we are minors, and we're not comfortable stepping out without our parent or guardian present. We've activated our cameras and alerts. Our father is State Senator Wilson, and his office has been notified of the stop." The mention of their father's name caused a slight pause in the officers' aggressive stance, but they maintained their positions. Anne continued with their practiced response. "We're happy to cooperate fully, but we'd like to contact our father first. We have his business card and a sealed letter of identification in our glove compartment. Would you like me to reach for it slowly?" The officers exchanged glances. This wasn't the response they'd expected. These teenagers weren't showing fear or defiance. Instead, they were displaying a level of composure and knowledge that seemed to catch the officers off guard. One of the younger officers stepped slightly closer, peering into the car. His expression changed as he noticed their private school uniforms, the youth center volunteer badges still pinned to their jackets, and the neat stack of textbooks in the back seat. The atmosphere began to shift. The initial aggressive energy started to dissolve into something more uncertain. These weren't the suspects they'd expected to find. Instead, they'd stopped two well-spoken teenagers who knew their rights, maintained their composure, and were clearly well prepared for exactly this type of situation. "Did you say Senator Wilson?" the younger officer asked, his voice notably softer. "I saw you both in the paper last week. You were at the state science fair, weren't you?" Dave nodded, his hands still visible. "Yes, sir. I won first place in robotics, and my sister Anne was one of the judges for the junior division. We're just heading home from the youth center where we volunteer 3 times a week." Anne added, maintaining her calm demeanor, "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but we'd really feel more comfortable waiting for our father or his representative before proceeding further. Everything about this stop is being recorded, and we're happy to provide any information you need through proper channels." The siblings' composed response had completely changed the dynamic of the situation. What had started as a high-tension traffic stop was transforming into something entirely different, a moment that would soon prove to be a turning point for everyone involved. The next few moments unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, though no one had rehearsed this particular scene. Anne and Dave remained perfectly still in their father's Tesla, their hands visible, their voices steady, while the 4 officers huddled a few feet away from the car, speaking in hushed tones. The siblings could hear fragments of their conversation through the open windows. State senators' kids, youth center volunteers, science fair winners. The officers' body language had shifted dramatically from their initial aggressive stance to something approaching uncertainty. Meanwhile, Dave's emergency alert had worked exactly as planned. Their father's chief of staff was already on the phone with the police department's senior leadership, and their father had left his budget meeting the moment he received the alert. But before any of these adults could arrive on the scene, something unexpected happened. The youngest officer, the one who'd recognized them from the paper, stepped forward again. His name tag read Officer Chen, and his face showed a mix of emotions: embarrassment, curiosity, and something that looked like admiration. "I have to ask," Officer Chen said, his voice genuinely interested, "where did you learn to handle a situation like this, sir, professionally?" Anne's hands remained on the steering wheel, but her voice carried a warmth that began to thaw the tension in the air. "Our father taught us, but not just him. We've had lots of practice at the youth center too. We actually help run workshops on positive interactions with law enforcement," Dave added, still keeping his hands visible. "We teach kids that staying calm and knowing your rights isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about creating opportunities for real conversation." The senior officer, whose badge identified him as Lieutenant Baker, moved closer to Officer Chen. His face had lost its earlier stern expression, replaced by genuine interest. "You run these workshops yourselves? At your age?" "Yes, sir," Anne replied. "We believe that when people know their rights and responsibilities, everyone stays safer. Would you like to see our curriculum? I have it right here on my phone. I can share it using the car's display if you'd like." The officers exchanged glances again, but this time their looks carried a different weight. Here they were, 4 armed officers who had stopped these teenagers expecting what exactly? Instead, they'd found themselves being offered a lesson in community relations by the very people they'd approached as suspects. Lieutenant Baker cleared his throat. "I think we can establish that this isn't the vehicle we're looking for. Your registration and insurance are clearly displayed, and your father's business card matches the Senate parking permit on your windshield." But instead of simply letting them go, something remarkable happened. The lieutenant took a step back, deliberately relaxed his stance, and asked, "Would you be willing to tell us more about these workshops you run?" For the first time since being pulled over, Anne's hands left the steering wheel, but only after carefully announcing her movement. She reached for her tablet in the backseat, where their presentation from last week's workshop was still loaded. "We'd be happy to," she said, her voice carrying the same confident tone she used when teaching at the youth center. "But first, could we move this conversation somewhere more appropriate? The side of the road isn't the best place for this discussion, and we're still technically in a traffic stop situation." The professionalism in her voice made Officer Chen smile. "She's right," he said to his colleagues. "Protocol matters." He turned back to the siblings. "There's a coffee shop just around the corner. Would you be comfortable meeting us there? Your father's office has already been notified of your location, and they can meet us there too." Dave and Anne shared a quick look. This wasn't part of their practice scenarios, but they both recognized an opportunity when they saw one. Their father had always taught them that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't anger or fear, but education and understanding. "We'd like that," Dave replied, already sending a text update to their father's office. "But we'll need to document the end of this traffic stop properly first. Lieutenant Baker, could you please state for our recording why we were stopped and that we're now free to go?" The lieutenant's face showed a mix of surprise and respect at the teenager's knowledge of proper procedure. He stepped closer to the car's camera and clearly stated that the stop was concluded, that no violations had been found, and that the siblings were free to go. As they drove the short distance to the coffee shop, followed by 2, not 4, police cars this time, Anne and Dave finally let out the breaths they'd been holding. Their hands were shaking slightly. They were still teenagers, after all, and the last 20 minutes had been intense. "We did it," Dave whispered, a small smile playing on his lips. "Everything Dad taught us, it actually worked." Anne nodded, carefully signaling as she turned into the coffee shop parking lot. "But this isn't over yet. Now comes the really important part." "What do you mean?" "Now we have a chance to turn this whole thing into something positive. Remember what Dad always says? Every challenge is an opportunity for change." As they parked the car and gathered their presentation materials, they could see their father's car pulling into the lot from the other direction. The look of pride on his face when he saw them, composed, professional, and ready to turn a potential tragedy into a teaching moment, made all those hours of practice worth it. What had started as a frightening traffic stop was about to become something none of them could have predicted. The beginning of a new kind of conversation between law enforcement and the community they served, led by 2 teenagers who had learned to transform fear into opportunity. The local coffee shop had never seen a gathering quite like this before. In one corner sat 2 teenagers in private school uniforms, their father, still in his Senate suit, 4 police officers, and the police department's community relations director, who had arrived shortly after receiving calls from both the department and the senator's office. The smell of coffee and freshly baked cookies filled the air, creating an almost surreal contrast to the tension-filled traffic stop that had occurred just 30 minutes earlier. The shop owner, sensing the importance of the moment, had quietly reserved the entire corner section for their impromptu meeting. First, Lieutenant Baker began, his coffee untouched in front of him. "I want to apologize. While we had legitimate reason to investigate a reported vehicle, our approach was overly aggressive." Senator Wilson nodded but remained quiet, letting his children take the lead, just as they had during the traffic stop. He'd spent years preparing them for moments like this, but watching them in action filled him with both pride and a deep sadness that such preparation was necessary. Anne opened her tablet and pulled up their presentation. "We understand you were doing your job," she said, her voice carrying the same practiced calm it had earlier. "That's actually something we discuss in our workshops, how both sides of any interaction can feel scared and defensive." Dave connected the tablet to his laptop, bringing up a series of slides they used at the youth center. "We developed this program after noticing how many of our younger students were afraid of law enforcement. But we also realized that fear goes both ways." Officer Chen leaned forward, genuinely interested. "What do you mean by that?" "Well," Dave continued, pulling up a slide showing statistics, "we've found that many officers enter situations already expecting confrontation. It creates a cycle of tension that's hard to break. But when both sides know what to expect and how to communicate." The community relations director, Mrs. Lee, was furiously taking notes. "This is remarkable," she said, looking up from her notebook. "You've basically created a peer-to-peer de-escalation program." Anne smiled, remembering how the program had started. "It began small, just us sharing what our dad had taught us with some of the younger kids at the center. But then we started inviting their parents, and soon we had community members asking to join. The senator finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "What happened today? It's exactly what we've been trying to prevent through these workshops. But it's also proven why they're so necessary." Lieutenant Baker looked uncomfortable but maintained eye contact. "The call we received described a luxury vehicle that matched your Tesla's description. The report suggested possible drug activity, but now I'm wondering if that call itself might have been motivated by other factors." "You mean because you saw two black teenagers in an expensive car?" Dave asked directly but without accusation. "That's another topic we cover in our workshops, how appearances and assumptions can lead to dangerous situations." The lieutenant's face reddened slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, and the way you both handled it. I've been on the force for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone remain so calm and professional during a stop." Anne pulled up another slide, this one showing role-playing exercises. "That's because we practice. A lot. In our workshops, we have kids and officers switch roles. Officers pretend to be civilians getting stopped, and kids pretend to be officers approaching a vehicle. It helps both sides understand each other's fears and perspectives." Officer Chen, who had been quietly absorbing everything, suddenly sat up straighter. "Wait, I remember now. Last month, my nephew came home talking about a workshop he'd attended at the youth center. He kept saying how it was the first time he wasn't scared to talk about his feelings about the police." "That was your program?" The siblings nodded, and Dave pulled up photographs from that particular workshop. "We call it walking in each other's shoes. It's amazing how much tension disappears when people start seeing each other as human beings first." Mrs. Lee was still taking notes. "This is exactly the kind of program we've been trying to develop at the department level. But coming from peers, especially young people like yourselves, it has so much more impact." The meeting continued for over 2 hours. What had started as an apology session transformed into an impromptu workshop. The officers shared their perspectives on why they sometimes responded with such heightened alertness. The siblings explained how their father's lessons in staying calm and knowing their rights had become a foundation for teaching others. By the time they were finishing their second round of coffee, hot chocolate for Anne and Dave, concrete plans were being made. Lieutenant Baker wanted to implement their workshop protocol into the department's training program. Mrs. Lee was already scheduling meetings to discuss expanding the youth center program to other communities. But perhaps the most touching moment came when Officer Chen pulled out his phone and called his nephew, putting him on speakerphone. The boy's excitement at learning he was talking to the actual creators of the workshop that had changed his perspective was palpable. As the meeting wound down, the coffee shop owner, who had been quietly observing while keeping their cups filled, approached their table. "I've been in this neighborhood for 20 years, she said, her eyes bright with emotion. "I've seen a lot of problems between the police and our community, but I've never seen anything quite like this, where a bad situation turned into something so hopeful." Senator Wilson finally allowed himself to relax slightly, watching his children pack up their presentation materials. What had started as one of every black parent's worst fears, their children being stopped by police, had transformed into something unprecedented. His kids hadn't just handled the situation, they turned it into an opportunity for real change. As they prepared to leave, Lieutenant Baker asked one final question. "How did you two become so good at this?" At turning confrontation into conversation. Anne and Dave shared a look before Anne answered. "We had good teachers. Our dad, our mom, our community. They taught us that change doesn't always come from fighting against something. Sometimes it comes from teaching others how to do better." The group walked out into the early evening air, but this time there was no tension, no fear. Instead, there was something that felt remarkably like hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected meeting could be the beginning of real transformation in their community. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. News of what happened during the traffic stop, and more importantly, what happened afterward at the coffee shop, spread quickly through both the police department and the community. But this story was different from the usual tensions between law enforcement and civilians. This was a story of transformation. The youth center's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. Director Brown, who had watched Anne and Dave grow up within those walls, could barely keep up with the requests pouring in. Police departments from neighboring districts wanted information about the workshop program. Community organizations were asking how they could implement similar initiatives. "I knew you two were special," Director Brown told the siblings during their regular volunteer session, "but what you've started here, it's beyond anything I could have imagined." Anne looked up from where she was helping a young girl with her homework. "We just did what felt right," she said simply. "Dad always taught us that when you're faced with prejudice, you have two choices. You can let it make you bitter, or you can use it to make things better." Dave, who was setting up for that afternoon's coding class, added, "The funny thing is, we never planned for any of this to happen. We were just trying to share what we learned with the kids here." The youth center had become the unofficial headquarters for their expanding program. Officer Chen had started dropping by during his off hours to help with the workshops. He brought along other officers who were interested in learning this new approach to community relations. One particular afternoon, about a week after the traffic stop, something remarkable happened. Lieutenant Baker arrived at the center with his teenage daughter. She had been having trouble at school, feeling caught between her love for her father and her friend's negative views of the police. "I thought maybe," the lieutenant said, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the casual setting of the youth center, "she could learn something from your program. And maybe I could too." The session that followed was unlike any they'd held before. The lieutenant's daughter shared her perspective of growing up in a police family, feeling like she had to defend her father to her friends. The other teens talked about their fears and frustrations with law enforcement. Anne and Dave guided the conversation with the skill of experienced mediators, helping both sides see the humanity in each other. "You know what's amazing?" one of the regular students said during a break. "When I first started coming to these workshops, I was so angry. My brother had been stopped by police for no reason, and I hated every officer I saw. But now," he glanced at Officer Chen, who had become a familiar face at the center, "now I understand that change has to start somewhere. And it starts with us learning to talk to each other." The local news had picked up the story, but not in the way everyone expected. Instead of focusing on the initial confrontation, they highlighted the innovative program that had emerged from it. A reporter spent a full day at the youth center, observing the workshops and interviewing participants. "What makes this program different," the reporter noted in her piece, "is that it's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about creating understanding on both sides." The siblings' father had been quietly supportive throughout all of this, providing resources when needed but letting his children take the lead. One evening, as they were driving home from the center, he finally shared what had been on his mind. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "when I taught you those safety protocols, I was just trying to keep you safe. I never imagined you'd turn them into something that could help so many others." Anne reached forward from the back seat and squeezed his shoulder. "But that's exactly what you taught us, Dad. You always said that knowledge isn't just for protection, it's for progress." The impact continued to grow. Mrs. Lee, the Community Relations Director, had presented their program to the police academy. The academy directors were so impressed that they wanted to make it part of their standard training curriculum. But they didn't want to just implement the program. They wanted Anne and Dave to help develop it. "We want to capture what makes your approach so effective," Mrs. Lee explained during a planning meeting. "It's not just about the content, it's about how you present it, how you create an environment where both sides feel heard." The siblings found themselves in the unusual position of teaching adults, twice their age, how to build bridges between communities. They showed how their role-playing exercises helped break down barriers, how their emphasis on clear communication could prevent misunderstandings, and how their focus on mutual respect created lasting change. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during a workshop when a rookie officer and a teenager from the center discovered they had more in common than they thought. Both had grown up in single-parent homes, both had struggled with stereotypes about their backgrounds, and both wanted to make their communities better. "This is what we've been missing," Lieutenant Baker said, watching the two young men share their stories. "We've been so focused on procedures and protocols that we forgot about the human connection." As the day wound down, Dave stood at the center's window, watching officers and teenagers walking to their cars together, still engaged in conversation. "You know what's really amazing?" he said to his sister. "A week ago, these same people might have seen each other as threats. Now they're exchanging phone numbers and making plans for the next workshop. Anne nodded, gathering her materials for the next day. That's because they finally see each other as people first, labels second, just like Dad always taught us. The transformation wasn't complete, they all knew that. Years of mistrust couldn't be erased in a few weeks. But something had shifted. A door had been opened, and people on both sides were choosing to walk through it. What had started as a frightening traffic stop had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger or fear, but the willingness to turn a negative moment into an opportunity for understanding. The siblings had shown their community that real change doesn't always come from grand gestures or loud protests. Sometimes it comes from simply being prepared, staying calm, and being willing to teach others how to do the same. 3 months after the traffic stop that changed everything, the youth center's main hall was packed to capacity. People stood along the walls, sat in every available chair, and even crowded in the doorways. The occasion: the first graduation ceremony for the expanded Building Bridges program that Anne and Dave had created. The crowd was unlike anything the center had seen before. Police officers in uniform sat next to community members they once viewed with suspicion. Teenagers who used to run at the sight of a patrol car now chatted easily with the officers they'd come to know through the workshops. Parents who had once warned their children to avoid law enforcement at all costs were now taking pictures of their kids receiving certificates alongside police academy cadets. If someone had told me 3 months ago that this would be happening, Director Brown whispered to Senator Wilson, I wouldn't have believed it. Your kids, they've done something incredible here. The senator watched as his children prepared to address the crowd. They looked older somehow, more confident, yet still maintained that essential innocence that made their program so effective. They weren't hardened activists or stern authority figures, they were simply young people who believed in the possibility of change. Anne stepped up to the microphone first. When we started this program, we were just sharing what our parents taught us about staying safe and maintaining dignity during difficult situations. We never expected it to grow into this. Dave joined her at the podium. But what we've learned over these past months is that everyone, literally everyone in this room, wanted the same thing. We all want to feel safe. We all want to be respected. We all want to be seen as human beings first. The siblings began calling up the graduates one by one. Each pair consisted of a community member and a law enforcement officer who had gone through the program together. As they received their certificates, many shared brief stories about their experiences. Officer Chen and his teenage partner, a young man who had once been arrested for protesting against police brutality, stood together at the microphone. 3 months ago, we were on opposite sides of a barrier we thought could never be broken, Officer Chen said. Today, we're teaching each other, learning from each other, and showing our communities that change is possible. His partner nodded. The most important thing I learned wasn't about laws or procedures, he added. It was about seeing the person behind the badge and letting them see the person behind their assumptions about me. The ceremony continued, but it was more than just a graduation. It was a celebration of transformation. Lieutenant Baker, who had been one of the officers at the original traffic stop, presented a special announcement that brought tears to many eyes. As of this morning, he said, standing tall in his dress uniform, our department has officially adopted the Building Bridges curriculum as mandatory training for all officers. But more than that, we're implementing a new protocol for traffic stops and community interactions based on what we've learned from this program. The lieutenant paused, looking directly at Anne and Dave. These young people taught us that safety doesn't come from fear or force, it comes from understanding and respect. They showed us that when we approach each situation expecting the best from people instead of assuming the worst, everyone benefits. The crowd erupted in applause, but the announcements weren't finished. Mrs. Lee from Community Relations stepped forward with even bigger news. The success of this program has caught the attention of police departments across the state. As of next month, we'll be launching pilot programs in 5 other cities, with Anne and Dave serving as program consultants. The siblings looked at each other in surprise. This was news to them. Their father smiled from his seat, knowing he'd have to explain later about the meetings he'd been having with state officials. But the most moving moment came when a small group of children from the center's after-school program took the stage. These were the kids Anne and Dave tutored regularly, the ones who had watched the program grow from the beginning. The youngest girl, barely 10 years old, spoke with clear confidence into the microphone. Before the Building Bridges program, I was scared whenever I saw a police car in my neighborhood. But Anne and Dave taught us that being scared doesn't help, understanding does. Now, I know Officers Chen and Baker by name. I know they're people just like me, trying to do their best. One of the older boys added, and the officers learned about us too. They learned why some of us get nervous around them. They learned about our lives, our families, our dreams. Now when they patrol our neighborhood, they don't just see problems to solve, they see people they know. The impact of the program had extended far beyond its original scope. Local businesses had gotten involved, offering internships to program graduates. The police department had created a youth advisory council, giving teenagers a voice in community policing decisions. Even the local government had taken notice, allocating funds for similar programs in other neighborhoods. As the ceremony wound down, Anne and Dave found themselves surrounded by well-wishers, but their attention was caught by a quiet conversation nearby. A veteran officer was talking to a group of teenagers, not about law enforcement or safety protocols, but about their college plans and career dreams. "That's what success looks like," Anne said softly to her brother. "Not the certificates or the expansion programs, but those small moments where people forget to be afraid of each other." Dave nodded, watching as more officers and community members mingled, sharing stories and making plans for future collaborations. "Remember what Dad always says. Real change doesn't happen in big dramatic moments, it happens in small steps, one conversation at a time." The youth center buzzed with energy long after the formal ceremony ended. People seemed reluctant to leave, caught up in the spirit of possibility that filled the room. What had started as a frightening traffic stop had grown into something that was changing lives, breaking down barriers, and creating a new model for community relations. As the siblings helped clean up afterward, Director Brown pulled them aside. "You know what makes your program so special?" she asked. "It's not just about teaching people how to act, it's about helping them understand why they should want to act differently. You've given everyone in this community a chance to be their best selves." The sun was setting as they finally left the center, casting long shadows across the parking lot where that fateful traffic stop had occurred. But now, instead of fear and tension, the space was filled with hope and possibility. Anne and Dave had shown their community that change was possible, not through force or confrontation, but through understanding, education, and the simple belief that people could learn to see each other's humanity. 1 year after the traffic stop that sparked a movement, the small local youth center had transformed into something extraordinary. What began as a frightening encounter between 2 teenagers and 4 police officers had grown into a nationwide model for community transformation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the center's newly expanded training facility, where Anne and Dave were preparing for a special anniversary event. The walls were covered with photos and news clippings documenting their journey, from that first tense traffic stop to today's celebration. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Dave asked, adjusting the display of program certificates. "Sometimes it feels like that traffic stop happened yesterday." Anne smiled, arranging chairs for the incoming visitors. "And sometimes it feels like we've been doing this forever. Look how much has changed." The changes were indeed remarkable. The Building Bridges program had expanded to 30 cities across the country. Their training manual, co-written with input from both law enforcement and community members, had become required reading at police academies in several states. But more importantly, the statistics told a powerful story. In areas where the program had been implemented, tensions between police and communities had decreased significantly. The center's doors opened, and people began streaming in for the anniversary celebration. Among them was Officer Chen, now a senior trainer in the program, accompanied by 3 new police academy graduates. "These rookies wouldn't believe me when I told them about that first traffic stop," he said, grinning. "They can't imagine approaching a situation guns drawn anymore. The protocols we learned from you have become second nature to them." Lieutenant Baker, recently promoted to captain, arrived with a group of community leaders from another state who had come to observe the program. "We've had departments from as far away as California and New York asking to implement this training," he announced proudly. "They're calling it the Wilson model now." The siblings shared a laugh at that. Their father, who had supported them quietly throughout this journey, would probably roll his eyes at having his name attached to the program. He had always insisted that the credit belonged to the community that had embraced change. As more people arrived, the center filled with a mix of voices and experiences. There were police officers chatting easily with teenagers they once might have viewed with suspicion. Community activists worked alongside law enforcement to plan new initiatives. Parents brought their children to meet the people who had helped make their neighborhoods feel safer. One of the most touching moments came when a group of elementary school students performed a skit they had written about conflict resolution. These kids had grown up with the Building Bridges program. To them, the idea of police and community working together wasn't revolutionary, it was normal. "That's the real victory," Anne whispered to her brother as they watched. "These kids won't have to learn how to stay safe during a traffic stop. They're learning how to prevent those situations from happening in the first place." The main presentation began with a video compilation of testimonials from across the country. There was the story of a police officer in Detroit who had used the program's techniques to de-escalate a tense situation. A community organizer in Atlanta spoke about how the program had helped heal decades of mistrust. A teenager from Chicago described how participating in the workshops had inspired her to pursue a career in law enforcement. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when the original 4 officers from that traffic stop took the stage together. They had all become instrumental in spreading the program, each in their own way. "We thought we were responding to a suspicious vehicle that day," Captain Baker said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "Instead, we encountered 2 young people who taught us more about real police work than any academy training ever could." Officer Chen added, "They showed us that safety isn't about force or fear. It's about understanding, respect, and the willingness to see each person as a human being first." The celebration continued with workshops and demonstrations throughout the day. In one room, new police recruits and teenagers worked together on role-playing exercises. In another, community members and officers collaborated on updating the training materials for different regions and cultures. Late in the afternoon, a surprise guest arrived, the governor, who had come to make an announcement. The Building Bridges program would receive state funding to expand to every county in the state. But more than that, the governor wanted to establish a youth advisory board for law enforcement policies, with Anne and Dave as founding members. "What these young people have created," the governor said, "is more than just a training program. They've created a new model for how communities and law enforcement can work together. They've shown us that the answer to our divisions isn't more force or more fear, it's more understanding." As the day wound down, Anne and Dave found a quiet moment to reflect. They sat in their favorite corner of the youth center, where they had spent countless hours tutoring kids and developing their program. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Dave said, watching the diverse crowd of people still mingling and chatting. "It's not the awards or the expansion or even the change policies. It's the fact that we've helped create a world where kids can feel safer than we did." Anne nodded, thinking about all the children who would grow up in communities where police officers were known by name, where tensions were resolved through dialogue rather than confrontation, where fear had been replaced by understanding. "Remember what Dad told us that night after the traffic stop?" she asked. "He said that sometimes the scariest moments in our lives can become the most powerful opportunities for change." I don't think any of us realized just how right he would be. The legacy of that frightening traffic stop had become something none of them could have imagined. It wasn't just about changing how police officers and communities interacted, it was about changing how people saw each other, how they listened to each other, how they worked together to create the kind of world they all wanted to live in. As the sun set on the anniversary celebration, casting warm light through the center's windows, the siblings watched as officers and community members left together, making plans for future projects and sharing stories about their experiences. The fear and tension that had marked that traffic stop a year ago had been transformed into something powerful and lasting, proof that even the most challenging moments could become opportunities for positive change. The Building Bridges program had become more than just a response to a frightening situation. It had become a blueprint for how communities could work together to create real, lasting change. And it all started because 2 teenagers decided to transform their fear into an opportunity to teach others about understanding, respect, and the power of seeing the humanity in everyone.